Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Miles. I'm the Dean of the University of Chicago Law School. And on behalf of Kate Baicker, Dean of the Harris School of Public Policy, it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's event. And it's wonderful that the Law School and the Harris School are partnering on this event, which is part of the Harris School series on perspectives. Today, we are delighted to welcome NBA Commissioner Adam Silver to learn more about his career and to learn about how he put his University of Chicago law degree into use, and also an opportunity for us to talk about the intersection of sports, public policy, and law. Sports is really in the forefront of culture, and especially over the past several years, we've seen prominent sports figures, fans, and sports associations themselves shape and react to changes in our culture and society. And under Adam's stewardship, the NBA has assumed a greater role in pivotal issues that affect our lives and our communities. Now, after graduating from the law school, Adam served as a law clerk in Federal District Court in New York for Judge Kimball Wood. And then he joined the law firm of Cravath, Swaine & Moore, where he focused on media and antitrust law. He then joined the NBA and held a variety of positions there that led him to responsibilities that were national and even international in scope. Notably, he served as the league's second in command, the role of Deputy Commissioner and Chief Operating Officer, for 8 years. In 2014, he was appointed NBA Commissioner. Adam leads a global sports and media organization that's built around 5 professional leagues. The NBA, of course, the WNBA, NBA G League, NBA 2K League, and Basketball Africa League. He has received numerous accolades for his accomplishments. I'll give you just a sampling of those. He was named the Sports Business Journal's Executive of the Decade and was ranked #1 on the publication's annual list of the 50 most influential people in the sports business. He has been named to Time Magazine's 50 most influential people in the world. Fortune has named him, can I keep embarrassing you? I'll keep going. I will end by simply saying that in 2016, he was the law school's Distinguished Alum of the Year and spoke at our graduation ceremony.
Finally, something of value.
So we're here today to learn more about Adam's career, his role as an executive, and as someone who guides the cultural touchstone of American professional basketball for its millions of fans. Please join me in welcoming Adam Silver back to the University of Chicago.
So maybe I'll kick off our conversation by asking you about the role that the NBA plays in social justice, in addressing disparities. I know there are a number of programs that you've been working on, including the Social Justice Coalition, but what role should sports in general and the NBA in particular play in addressing social disparities and justice?
Sure, and let me just say quickly, it's an honor to be here with both of you, and very intimidating to be interviewed by 2 deans. So,
we're scary.
And I keep thinking I know David Rubenstein a bit, and when he was building this building, I'm not sure this is what he intended it to be used for me to be interviewed in this beautiful palace. But anyway, back to your question. It's a fascinating one when you start thinking about responsibility and obligation, because I do feel it personally. In terms of social justice, and it's one that I know has been passed down to our players, I think from generations of players who came before them. I mean, one example I've used before, and then the NBA is a relatively young league. For those who follow the league, we just celebrated our 75th anniversary. This is, those who saw the All-Star game in Cleveland, we had many of our greatest players ever there. And when I think about Bill Russell, for example, who is, in essence, the Babe Ruth of the NBA, he's still around. He's a guy I call, he's a guy I talk to. I mean, that's just the sense of a young sport. But so then that same very person, Bill Russell, when Martin Luther King delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial, he was there. He was in the front row there. And at the time, that was considered incredibly controversial. And it's well known he was the subject of a lot of racial animus in Boston as a Celtic in those days. And I've talked to teammates like Bob Cousy about it, who's also, I think he's 92 or 93, he's still around, somebody I talked to, that they still lived through a time where they couldn't stay in certain hotels because black players weren't allowed in those hotels, et cetera. So I think it, from early days, became part of the DNA of this league. And the other thing I think where this league has done a particularly good job, and I'm inheriting this, so I'm not taking credit or at all for it, but that is celebrating the players that came before. I just say to all of you, again, who followed the NBA, prior to that halftime in Cleveland, when all those 75 greatest living who could be there came out on the floor, we were all, before the game, in a room where they were taking pictures of the players, and it wasn't open to the media. And Chris Paul, of course, a current player who just stepped down as president of our Players Association, of our Players Union, one of the 75 greatest, he asked if he could have a microphone. And he then, because he wanted to speak to many of those elderly, in particular, players who had never made a lot of money, never played on such the big stage that these players do today, and to thank them. And it was so well received by those players, and it was spontaneous too, it wasn't arranged. And I think that, and it was a thank you for so much that has been passed down for that opportunity today. And again, I just think that that's not only unique to the NBA in terms of leagues, but I think in terms of institutions, where you have that multi-generation, they're around, they're being celebrated. So for me, I feel that obligation in terms of being the commissioner now. As Tom pointed out, I've been with the league, so it's almost 30 years now. I've been commissioner since 2014. And I think my predecessor, David Stern, I know felt that same pull, that as a league, because roughly 80% of our players are black, they're frankly some of the most prominent black people in the whole world, especially with digital and social media now. And I think we feel an obligation to serve them, to partner with them, and to use this incredibly powerful voice we have to speak out on these issues.
Well, just to follow up on the issue you raised about the NBA versus other leagues and the controversy that you sometimes see, the NFL has been a little more of a touchstone in recent years for some of the cultural controversies, from Colin Kaepernick taking a knee to some halftime shows. How has the NBA has also had its share of controversial moments and challenges, and how have you navigated those?
Well, first, in terms of the NFL, they are significantly bigger than we are in just one metrics, television ratings, for example. Yeah, that too. Although our guys are taller, so I think for the NFL, almost everything that happens in their league gets magnified and amplified in a way that maybe isn't the case for other leagues, although, to your point, we get our fair share of attention. And I think we all have our own unique issues that we deal with, and I put baseball and hockey in those categories as well. I think for us, it's what I found is, go back, some people will remember sort of Michael Jordan, now an owner in the NBA, was my generation, a player roughly same age. He famously said, I guess it was in the 1980s, that Republicans wear sneakers too, when he was asked to take a position on a Senate race in North Carolina. It would be impossible, I think, for a player of that stature to take a position like that today. I think the fans, teammates, employees demand that people take positions these days, demand that I take positions, and demand it of our players. And that's not unique to sports right now. There's some high-profile companies right now going through controversies because CEOs weren't willing to take positions that employees and customers were unhappy with. And I don't know any other way to say it, but it's hard. I think some people don't think it's a cop-out a little bit sometimes. I don't mean to say that I therefore don't take issues, but it's hard to navigate these very difficult times. Where in University of Chicago, Bob Zimmer has been a leader in terms of talking about free speech, but it certainly doesn't feel that way when you're in the middle of things, that, it seems like people are just waiting for you to say the point of view that is acceptable. And until you say it, they're going to beat on you. And I think for our players in particular, it's one thing for me as a leader of organization, trained at University of Chicago Law School, being a career working under David Stern and being prepared as best I can for these moments. It's something else, I think, for players in our league begin at 19 years old. Say the average age of a player in our league is roughly 26 or something like that. I mean, for them to be thrust in the spotlight, to be asked about issues in China, Russia, the Middle East, etc., I think sometimes people see it as a hypocrisy that they're not as comfortable speaking out on those issues, but they also have lived experiences. I'm going to take LeBron, for example. If you're a young black man growing up in Akron, Ohio, and he and I have talked about this, he can speak directly to certain lived experiences, and just be honest, when he's asked about Uyghur Muslims, he can't. And that's not satisfactory to a lot of people, and I understand that. And they're entitled then to their opinion, and I don't want to confuse this sort of canceling notion with criticism, where people are absolutely entitled to criticism and turn the channel and say, we're not going to watch you as a result. And that's where we find ourselves often. And I'll say for me as the leader of the organization, often I think the best I can do is to be incredibly transparent. And then when dealing with those issues, rather than say, the worst thing I think in this day and age is sort of to no comment media, but rather than to say, this is how we feel as an organization, and this is how we got to that decision. And then if people disagree with us, okay, at least a large segment of the people who disagree, I find will at least respect our transparency. And we'll say, we understand you have competing interests, and that's where you come out. We may not like it. And I think you touched on the NFL, take the whole issue around Colin Kaepernick and taking a knee, whatever. What's fascinating to me, and I know like the Harris School sort of specializes in evidentiary, data and research. It's very confusing, I find, in the media, even the mainstream media, that often relies on two sides of every story given equal weight, where, the NFL says this, or Colin Kaepernick said, critics say that, and so you end up trying to calibrate through Twitter what positions you should be taking because nothing's weighted. And by way of example, lots of you may remember, right in the middle of the Colin Kaepernick controversy, President Trump is blasting him, etc. Nike decides to do a promotion around Colin Kaepernick. And the media, in the first instance, was saying, these people have lost their mind. Aren't they following what's happening? Of course, sales went up, and the stock price went up because, and I remember, talking to Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, about this generally. This wasn't necessarily a specific comment around Colin Kaepernick, but he was once speaking to a group of us at the NBA, and somebody asked him for marketing advice. This is the person who created Nike, and he said, here's my advice. He goes, focus on the people who like you, not the people who don't like you. And it was interesting. They knew their consumer. And I think often that even in the case of Colin Kaepernick, where there's no doubt there was a segment of America led by President Trump who was saying, how dare this young man take a knee, it's disrespectful, whatever else. Look where the NFL is now. They still account for most of the highest rated television programs in the country. Nothing's close. No form of entertainment is close to NFL ratings right now. And so the other thing, and I struggle with this issue also, is, again, that calibration of whether or not people are truly one-issue fans, or whether they're expressing their distaste for something, but hey, at the end of the day, I'm a football fan or I'm a basketball fan. Yeah, I'm a sophisticated person. I disagree with Colin Kaepernick, or I disagree with LeBron or whoever else. I disagree with the commissioner of the league, but I still love basketball, and I'm going to continue to be a fan.
Adam, can I ask about when you first became commissioner? There was an incident where an owner engaged in racist speech, and you reacted very strongly to that. You denounced his speech. You banned him from the league. You urged the owners to expel him from ownership. I think you gave him the largest financial penalty the league had ever assigned. But yet, technically, you work for the owners. So was that a hard decision? How did you think about that? Like, in some sense, who were you thinking about when you made that decision?
It wasn't a hard decision, but it was an uncomfortable decision. I think not only because I work for the owners, Donald Sterling, again, I had been with the league for roughly 22 years when I became commissioner. And so Donald Sterling had been an owner in the league for that entire time. He was one of my 30 bosses. And I wasn't so concerned as to whether I was doing the right thing with Donald. On the other hand, I was a very new commissioner, and I was nervous that other owners would say, where's the line? Like, because and I may have been a little bit naive because I was so early in my commissionership as how that decision would be received. And I think I didn't know at the time that I think he's the only owner that's ever been removed from Major League Sports. There's others who've been given long suspensions, but I think he was the only one removed. I mean, it seemed clear to me that it was a violation of the moral fiber, of the league, that what he had done was so extreme, and it wasn't just what he had said. He was completely unapologetic, and people may remember, and then he doubled down, after he said it. So it wasn't a close call from that standpoint, but I think for me, in thinking about my job as commissioner, it's true that I'm hired and could potentially be fired by the 30 owners. That's who I work for. But I think, like any CEO in this day and age, you really work for your employees. And that's in part the players, but there's thousands of people in the NBA, in addition to the employees, who are part of our enterprise. I feel you work for your fans, your customers, you work for your communities. So what I was doing, I believed, was even, frankly, in the best interest of the owners collectively. I mean, sometimes I've been in, and every commissioner gets put in this position where a particular owner is saying, you work for me, do this. And the response generally is, it's true, I work for you, but 1/30 of me, if we have 30 teams, works for you, but I work for the collective interest of all teams, and that in some cases may be adverse to the interest of that one particular owner.
So speaking of leading front and center in these issues, the NBA has really been at the forefront of thinking about how to balance the economic consequences and the public health consequences of dealing with the COVID pandemic. And we think about this a lot from a public policy perspective, and there are lots of things that you're trying to balance in thinking about the well-being of the players, the employees, the fans, but the communities in which you operate. And you had a leadership role in the bubble strategy. And how did you think about balancing those competing needs from the perspective of the well-being of the community at large?
One of the ways that I was able to think of it and where I really benefited was this great partnership we have with our players. Because, and we were all talking a little bit about this before we came out here today, about the benefits of being here in person, being together, students back in classrooms, et cetera. It's not that different to me in running a business, that adage that 2 heads are better than 1, and 10 heads are better than 2. And I'm very fortunate that not only do I have a fantastic group of colleagues that I've been working with at the league for a long time, but also really good relationships with our Players Association and our players. So when it came time to thinking about how it was we could balance those competing issues, the health and safety of those players, their economic well-being, and not just our players, but the thousands of people who are dependent. I mean, when you roll up all the NBA teams and the arena staff, it's well over 50,000 jobs. There's a lot of people dependent on this enterprise. And I think we had the benefit of, and part of it was on Zoom, but I think in this case, because we had already built those relationships, it's a little different if you already have those relationships and you're talking to someone on Zoom than if you don't really know people. But we spent hundreds of hours together trying to find the right balance and the right accommodation. And it was roughly 2 years ago, March 11, 2020, where we shut down the league. And even in making that decision, again, fortunate, have these strong partnerships, including with team owners, by the way, where when we shut down on March 11th, I don't believe anyone at that point had suggested that we shut down, or that any of the arena sports stop operating. But just stepping back a little bit, what had happened there was we have a large business in China, and beginning in January, I was hearing from colleagues in China that there was this, this new novel coronavirus there, before people were calling it COVID, that it was different than SARS and H1N1 that I had sort of lived through during my tenure at the NBA, but had never extended from Asia and certainly never come to the United States in a large-scale way. And there was initially people thought it would be somewhat of the same. But we were fortunate because not only having gotten that news, but having had some terrific advisors, including a well-known virologist named David Ho, who went on to be Time Man of the Year for the work he did around HIV and AIDS related to Magic Johnson, which is when I got to the league in the early 90s. He started consulting with us then, and he said, based on what's happening in China, I suggest, and rumors that there was some spread. This is in late January, so we shut down in March, but he had suggested we start testing symptomatic players. And we put in place lab relationships in all our team cities so that if players had flu-like symptoms, sore throats, temperatures, et cetera, we could test them for COVID. And then jump ahead to March 11th, Rudy Gobert who was the player who tested positive that day at Utah Jazz when we shut down our league. He was something like the 10th player we had tested, and obviously the first player that was positive. Mm-hmm. So we were prepared in some way, but this goes to your question about the difficulty. When we then shut down, we were heralded, canary in the coal mine, good for the NBA. They've gotten not just the country, but the world's attention. 3 days later, newspapers were editorializing against us because they were saying, how dare they use all these COVID tests? Because we then went and, think of now the millions, but we were advised by our panel of doctors that because Utah Jazz had a positive player, and then it turned out another player there on that team, we found out was positive the next day, you should go back. Then they were saying 3 days, the period got longer, so you should test the teams they played within, and then there were some the referees and test those teams, so that you follow the chain, from a public health standpoint. And so all of a sudden we were using, let's say, 100 COVID tests. Just think nothing. But the next thing you knew, it's like these rich, entitled NBA players and owners feel that they have access to tests nobody else does. So we got slammed a few days later. I'm like, all right, all testing stopped. And then, and part of the reason I'm raising that, one of the issues from a public health standpoint, we then had to deal with when we, at first, when it was proposed that we would play in a so-called bubble, and again, I think for people who followed it really was on a campus. It's sort of part of Disney World. I was calling it a campus at least. I'm not sure they would call it a campus. A large theme park with,
an enclosure.
With an enclosure, with not real walls though, but an enclosure that initially, because somebody coined the word bubble and I was resisting that, it sounded like science fiction. There were no vaccines at the time, and when people suggested, well, NBA is going to restart in a bubble, again, people were, and newspaper columnists, et cetera, public health officials were very critical of us. One, because when we outlined our protocols, they felt we potentially would be using too many tests because we were testing everyone in this community every day. And we waited, and partly till there were sufficient tests. And in fact, we went out of our way in Florida. We had a WNBA bubble and an NBA bubble in northern Florida to arrange privately to bring our own testing machines in, just so there was no question for the people of Florida that we weren't taking away needed tests. But there was enormous uncertainty as to whether this would work. And remember, this isn't ancient history. This isn't that long ago. But a lot of NBA players and coaches, officials, others who were going to be coming into this community were understandably frightened as to whether it would work. People were still essentially locked in their homes, and people were using Clorox and FedEx boxes and things like that. And so people were like, and so it was pretty nerve-wracking. And I'd say we didn't have a lot of certainty other than we felt it was the right thing to do. We felt, honestly, from an economic standpoint, that we were striking the right balance for our own business. We also felt that, and we're being told by people, it was then in the Trump administration and others, that they would view it positively if we were providing programming, entertainment to Americans who are, and globally to people who are largely stuck at home. But there was never any, and certainly for me, I'm never quite certain about anything, but there was never a moment where we were like, oh, we got it right. And that every day we were in the bubble. And so we started in the beginning of July. And by the time the Lakers that won the championship down there, that was mid-October. So it was a long stretch. And I spent about a month in the bubble. I was in and out. But we would test everybody at night, and then the PCR test would go to the lab overnight. We'd get the results in the morning. It was nerve-wracking, as to whether this thing was going to continue to work. Because I'll just add, there were also, in order to operate, we had thousands of people in there at the start. You had a lot of Disney employees, also frankly, who were happy to be back at work. But because of relations with their unions, they would not agree to all be tested. This was pre-vac. There were no issues about whether people get vaccinated. It was just about whether they would get tested. And the unions wouldn't agree. Part of it was a larger fight they were having Disney, because they said, if you're going to test these workers, you should test all workers. And they had 50,000 workers. That wasn't going to work. But so you had a lot of unvaccinated people moving in and out of our community, staying socially distant, wearing face masks, plastic shields, all kinds of things that people thought would work. But you kind of never knew at any point whether we were going to get shut down. And it was sort of just truly anxiety producing until the last day when, like, wow, it worked. We didn't have a single positive case through the entire time we were down there.
That's right. Can I ask about the international popularity of the NBA, which has grown tremendously? And engagements with other countries can sometimes be complicated. They don't have the same degree of freedoms that we do. And you've mentioned China a few times, and obviously the NBA's relationship with China has received a lot of attention. As you think about the trajectory of the NBA internationally, how do you think about those international relationships, and how do you think about whether they're successful or not?
Well, number one, I think about it a lot, and again, back in the category of some often very hard and difficult issues for us on where we draw lines. We have continued to do business in China despite a very well-known incident where we were taken off air, off Chinese Central Television, both because of a tweet from the general manager of the then Houston Rockets regarding Hong Kong, and then because of my response, where I said that we understand that people in China may disagree with what he said, but that one of the values of the NBA, like the University of Chicago, is freedom of speech, and that we're going to support it, and that this NBA person has every right to say those things. And that was not received well in China, and off CCTV we came. I guess the question then could have been at that moment, well, if they're taking you off CCTV, should you therefore suspend your business in China completely? Because other aspects of our business continued. For example, the Tencent, which is a streaming service in China, for the most part continued to carry our games, although lots of different aspects of our business were shut down. When I stepped back and thought about our mission, which is essentially, my shorthand is to improve people's lives through basketball, to me, there was nothing inconsistent with continuing to distribute our intellectual property, those games in China, despite the government's reaction to that general manager speaking out. And it's kind of the test I've tried to use around the world. Now, someone could arguably say, well, we suspended all business in Russia, shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, as many other American businesses did as well, and also I'd say with some guidance from the US government. And that did not seem inconsistent to me, given the posture as an American company that our government was taking, and given what was actually happening on the ground. But sort of where I started, I recognize that not everyone's going to agree with the decisions we make in each of these situations. I also think I think about the larger context we operate in. I mean, for example, in China, the NBA is often singled out as a business that either has compromised its values or is being hypocritical in some way operating in China. Yet virtually every Fortune 100 business based in the United States does business, if not extensive business, in China. And I do think sometimes it connects directly to your earlier question, Kate, about the social justice stands our players have taken. And people see it's an opportunity, I think, to demonstrate what they see as the hypocrisy between standing up for social justice in the United States and not standing up for human rights in China. I can only say that they're, of course, entitled, and we as an organization, to speak out on those issues that we feel most comfortable speaking out on. And I also, to me, think it's perfectly appropriate. It's almost the very basis of our federalistic government that sort of always the push to sort of localize things, that players that can, especially American players, that can speak out very personally about things that they understand through firsthand knowledge, through families, through, as I said, lived experiences, and aren't as comfortable speaking out about issues internationally that they don't know as well. And at the same time, and I'll just, Russia versus China, where our government, I mean, for example, in, I think our last trade deal with China negotiated in 2020, China was required to buy more from the United States. I mean, we are an export business to China, and there are aspects in terms of foreign policy that I think differ from domestic issues in which you do look to your government. And whether it was the Obama, Trump, Biden administration, that at some point it's very difficult to practice our own foreign policy, and that we look to our government, our federal government, to be giving us some guidelines on where we should be operating and not. And so, again, I feel, that maybe old school political science major, I still think, I believe in soft power. I mean, it's my personal view. I think engagement keeps us safe and prosperous. I think there are great benefits. There's a long history through sports. Think back ping pong diplomacy with China in particular, or through arts and culture, of creating connections and ultimately empathy between people of other nations, which, at least historically to me, has been a very positive thing. So when you're in times of real conflict and tension, frankly, like we are right now with China, that you can lean on some of these relationships. And in case anyone's wondering, yes, we're a business too. So I don't want to sit here and say that's all altruism. I mean, my job is to grow our business. But I think at the same time, to grow it in a way that remains consistent with our mission and our values. And I think I'm continuing to do that.
Well, so you're a business, you're an employer. There are all sorts of public policy levers that aim to increase representation, diversity, equal opportunity in the workplace. The NBA has its own representation issues to struggle with, as do all such large enterprises. And we've heard recently about the shortcomings of some approaches like the Rooney Rule to try to make sure that there is equal representation and equality of opportunity at the highest levels of organizations. What's the NBA doing, and what should it be doing?
The NBA does an enormous amount in that area, and again, I think every league is different, so it's hard for me to comment directly on the Rooney Rule, right? You must be a big football fan, but it's but in the NBA, I'm particularly proud of where we currently are. Just take coaches, for example, which is what the Rooney Rule is directed at. I think 16 of our 30 coaches are people of color. But we never stand on our laurels. I've learned, and again, this goes directly to, I think, what you preach in your school. We try to be very data-driven. I think one of the things I've learned as a practical matter is that you have to do more than talk about it, although that is important when we have our team meetings, our meetings with our owners, to be constantly talking about it, but also to be regularly going to the data. Here's where we are, here's where we were, here's where we'd like to be, position by position, because you have coaches, obviously, or general managers in high-profile positions, but there are hundreds of employees at every team, thousands of employees at the league. So it requires constant focus. But in addition to the words, we found that one of the initiatives we have with our coaches is to create a database and a pool, for example, so that if a team is looking to hire a coach, they're not, even though the 30 teams are obviously all competing against each other, they're not off on their own, that they can go immediately to a database and see, all right, here, I think currently there's something like 300 coaches in the database who have been vetted, their past experience. You know, if I want to ensure that I'm interviewing a diverse pool of candidates, I can find them here. I don't have to start from scratch. I think those things really matter as well. And we at the league office try to do that across the board for all positions, because it's not just coaches, people who want to work even in the business side of sports. I mean, often, you know, they're willing to travel, they're willing to relocate, you know, to go where the jobs are. And it's also certain markets aren't as diverse as others, just in terms of their population there. So there's a lot that we can do and a lot that we stay focused on.
I'm so glad to hear you're drawing on the data for that.
No, it's honestly, it's my, you know, credit to University of Chicago. It's something we keep coming back to, you know, in terms of data. And it frustrates me sometimes because it's not, you know, there's so much that's anecdotal these days. And it's hard just earlier, you're in the position of running a business because everything often in the media seems to be given equal weight. It's one of the downsides. I mean, there's a lot good that comes through social media. I don't think we'd be focused on Ukraine the way we are if we couldn't see those images. So many of them come from people holding up iPhones, and then it gets broadcast on CNN or Fox or MSNBC, so that's incredible. But on the other hand, often you're in these positions where it's all anecdotal, and nobody is able even to crunch the right data to help you make decisions.
Can I ask about labor relations generally? I mean, even before you were commissioner, when you were deputy commissioner, you oversaw 3 major negotiations, successful negotiations with the Players Association. And we've seen, you know, from time to time other sports, most recently Major League Baseball, have real difficulty in negotiating with the players' unions. What do you think are the elements of a successful relationship with the players' union?
So many things. I mean, one, I'll say, you know, for those who, you know, are studying contract law or maybe even particularly labor law, you know, Tom, as you know, I mean, it's a very specialized field in that labor negotiations, although ultimately they result in a contract, not unlike other kinds of contracts, it's a very unique kind of negotiation in that there's particular policies that have been adopted just to focus on labor. You have a Department of Labor. You have, you know, constraints on what you can do and say in those negotiations, understandably under the labor laws. And it's something that I'm always reminding a lot of our teams that maybe in certain cases have owners that don't operate in businesses where they're dealing with unions. And that is that it's, at the end of the day, no matter how irrational you may feel your opponent is being in a negotiation, and not to suggest that our players have been, but that you always have to come back to getting a deal done with this group of people. I mean, maybe in other industries they can replace the employees or, even bring in replacements for a short period of time. There's never been a consideration of that in the NBA. These are unique people on the planet. There's only one Steph Curry and LeBron James and, et cetera. I mean, there's no pretending that we could say we can operate without you guys. So, it's a form of mutually assured destruction. And so where I think so many people negotiate for a living, if you get to a point in a deal, I assure you, David Rubenstein gets to a point in a deal where he just doesn't feel he's being dealt with properly, whether that's just his subjective impression. He says, move on. Let's find another company to buy, or whatever he does. He's like, I've had enough of these people. In labor relations, you can bang the table, yell, and then there they are. The next day, there's those same folks. And then even, I'd go further, that even to the extent you may think you have an advantage in that negotiation, either because, wow, they're not as focused on that issue, they don't see the future the way we do, unless you're fair, in my view, because the deal gets done, and here you are sitting across from these very same group of people, they're going to find another way to get at you. They're going to find a way to exercise that leverage because you ultimately did a deal that they perceive as unfair. So for me, I mean, it's no pun intended, but it's very labor intensive. I mean, there's no shortcuts. It's like hours and hours of willingness to sit, listen more, explain, work through issues, and hope for compromise. I think that, and by the way, the NBA doesn't have a perfect track record by any means. I mean, we had, I think around 2010, 2011, we had a work stoppage with our players. We ended up opening Christmas Day that year. But at least, to me, what you have to make sure you do is when you're not sort of in those heated discussions, sort of those periods leading up to collective bargaining agreements and right after them, really work hard to continue building those relationships so you begin with trust. I mean, I've lived through, with all my years at the league and collective bargaining negotiations, certainly I wasn't running, but I was a person in the room. I mean, there were long periods, and with heads of Players Association no longer there, and again, I'm not even blaming them, but we would spend months debating whether the financials were real. We'd have audited financials, and they'd say, you sophisticated owners, you have ways of playing with numbers, you're doing whatever else, comes back from the league, well, wait, these are audited financials, we don't want to go to jail, we didn't, David Stern once said, are you suggesting we change the 8 to a 5? It was sort of like, what does that mean? But I got it. There was an enormous amount of mistrust in the room, and it was the kind of thing that once you get in that really tense situation, it's very hard to build trust in that moment. And unfortunately then, and I think this is where other leagues, other industries find themselves, once there's no longer trust, it's just pure leverage. It's like, all right, players say, we're going to strike, we're going to withhold our services. Employer can say, we're going to lock you out, we're not going to let you come to work, we're not going to pay you. And that's the worst case scenario, because then it's just pure economic might, sometimes with the government stepping in, unfair labor practices, or whatever else. But the goal is, to me, is to start very early, build relationships, and demonstrate, as I think we have in this league right now, that we can do things that are mutually beneficial. We do have issues where we don't agree, but that we can do it respectfully, and compromise on them.
Well, I know that we want to be sure to take some audience questions, and we can take audience questions from those in the room and those remotely. So are there folks with questions? Michelle will relay them.
So I have the task of picking just a few questions out of a list of many, many great questions that students have submitted. So I will start with this first one, which is, at their best, sports are a public good and they mean a lot to communities. Do you think community-owned teams, similar to the Packers, could work in the United States?
Well, to the questioner's point, it seems to work in the case of the Packers. So it can work. I think now that it's interesting. There's some, new financial concepts out there in the market now of where new financial instruments where people can come together and do things collectively. I guess DAOs they're calling them. So it's something I'm paying attention to. On the other hand, my view is along the lines of the questions we've all been talking about. I think personal responsibility is very important. And I do worry a little bit that if it became too diffuse, that there's not, ultimately it's embodied in a person or a group of people who have to take responsibility for that community, for that group of players, for managing that franchise. That worries me a little bit. But I recognize the world changes. And so, and also just as a financial matter, these teams have grown in value so much that whether you have other teams that become public, I mean, that's a form, of course, just a public company where it's kind of the equivalent of what that questioner is asking, that when you get into so many billions of dollars, you have a very small pool of people, literally in the world, who are in a position to write those kinds of checks. So I think we will be looking at other forms of financing in the future. I realize I'm looking at you, but it wasn't your question. Whoever, thank you for that question. Yeah.
All the students here. The next question. What, in your opinion, is the potential for soft power in sports to influence policy discussions, and what is the NBA in particular doing?
So I touched on that a little bit before, and I'm accused sometimes of being naive when I talk about soft power, and there are, I think, a group of political scientists, thought leaders who look back on sort of the period of Nixon, Henry Kissinger to the present and say, look, what has it gotten us? I mean, I think those people would say, as I said earlier, it's kept us pretty safe, over a long period of time. So I'm not ready to give up on it. On the other hand, probably I, like a lot of people, have been somewhat radicalized by what's happening in Ukraine right now. I mean, I certainly didn't see that coming, just as someone who follows the news and pays attention to global events. And so you also realize that sometimes, it's hard power. It's might, it's necessary. I mean, for many of the same, I think, political groups that we're talking about, frankly, massive decreases in defense spending, only a year ago, may have changed their tune a bit recently because there's an acknowledgement that there's evil actors in the world. And boy, talk about, asking me about obligation of the NBA, then you start thinking much more serious and broader context, what's the obligation of the United States? And I think that becomes related to these areas. So I think it's such an interesting area. I will to say lastly that, now roughly 30 years at the NBA, every administration since I've been at the league, Republican and Democrat, has come to the NBA at various times and asked us to exercise soft power. I mean, we hosted many years ago when Bush 43 was president, we hosted the Iranian team in our summer league in Las Vegas. I mean, there have always been instances, and a lot of, before there was such strong China animus in the last few years, we were encouraged to do a lot of the things that we were doing in China as positive to building relationships. So at the end, I do think we are an American company. We have to work in unison with our government and our State Department, but at least from firsthand experience, I think building those relationships can be very positive.
Following up on that soft power point, there were a number of NBA players who did PSAs, public service announcements for vaccination, but that is clearly a very controversial topic writ large, but also even among players, there are strong disagreements there. And how do you see the role of individuals versus the league in complementing public policy on things like public health?
Well, that's an area where, I mean, as you recall, I mean, the country has shifted a bit when the vaccine first was developed and came to market. The strongest resistance was in the African American community. And the CDC, other divisions of the government came to us and said, can you be helpful here? And we went to many of our players, some current players, some legends like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, did a lot, public service announcements and others. And, it was more to them, is this something you'd be interested in doing? And they embraced it, frankly. And not all of our players did. And what's interesting, some of our players went and got vaccinated and didn't want to be public about it. I mean, they felt tension in their own communities with their friends and said, and to the point now where it seems, because there are some NBA players, Kyrie Irving is one of them, very prominent player, controversial law in New York right now that doesn't allow him to play unvaccinated, but allows visiting unvaccinated players to play, kind of a bizarre result. But he's in a tiny group of NBA players who aren't vaccinated. It sort of goes to my point earlier about sort of the weight of the evidence. I mean, so we have 98% of our players vaccinated. I get it. Kyrie Irving playing for the Brooklyn Nets in New York is going to get an enormous amount of attention, and deservedly so. But most of our players have embraced getting vaccinated. Incidentally, just as a nod to University of Chicago, I mean, two people very influential on the policies we put in place were Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, because it came literally like right out of Nudge. Let's design a set of policies working with our Players Association. I mean, couldn't be done unilaterally, where we agreed we could create these incentives to get vaccinated. And if you get vaccinated, you can do these things, you can go to restaurants, you don't have to test it so early in the morning. You have the right not to remain vaccinated, but if so, then you have to live under these protocols. And I think that was extraordinarily effective in getting us to 98%.
Given the recent trend towards player empowerment and the ability of star players to dictate circumstances, how can league policy evolve to protect small markets and league competitiveness?
Again, I'm going to go to the data for a second and sound very defensive, because I hear this all the time about this trend to player empowerment. And so I've been at the league for 30 years, but I spent a lifetime as a fan. I mean, just by way of example, I may have this slightly off, but so we're in the 75th anniversary of the league. In the first 65 years of the league, 3 teams won 60% of the championships. You know, Lakers, Boston, and the Bulls. And players had their way in terms of going to markets they wanted to be in and using their leverage. And some in this room may recall, generally a younger group, I'm sure Tom does, that, you know, there was a time when players were drafted for teams that just said, I'm not going. And they would hold out. And before we had what we now have we have a rookie scale and we have a max amount for individual players, all negotiated with the Players Association. It used to be commonplace that players would say, I just don't like my contract. And I just 3 prominent examples. I mean, Michael Jordan, and not to pick on him by any means, he's one of my bosses now, but his last year on the Bulls, I think the cap was roughly $27 million. He was making $32 million. You know, Magic Johnson had the leverage at the time to negotiate a 25-year contract, and Larry Bird, we still have an exception to the salary cap today called the Larry Bird exception. We had to create an exception for Larry Bird because he wasn't going to live under the cap in the Boston Celtics. So only by means of saying, I think there's some of what is player empowerment to me is a very positive thing in that players feel safer and more comfortable speaking out on issues they care about today than they ever did before. And it's, you know, only a few years ago, commentators were saying to some of our prominent players, literally shut up and dribble. And I think guys may have been intimidated in the old days from speaking out or didn't feel safe speaking out or whatever else or didn't think the institution was going to support them. So I think there's that kind of player empowerment. Like, do I like guys pushing their way out of contracts or pushing a trade? Of course not. I would love, and my desire is that every player honor his contract, and maybe there's other things we can do when we go into collective bargaining to ensure that. But to me, I think if you looked back over the last 50 years, it's not as aberrant as it appears right now. You've always, you know, famously Will Chamberlain, you know, forced to trade. I mean, it's just, Kobe Bryant was drafted by one, people forget he was drafted by Charlotte, then ended up in LA. I mean, there's lots of examples over the years, and so I don't think this is so new, but I get it. I know I have to deal with that perception. And so do our players. I mean, and thus lastly, I think what was sort of added to the end of that question was this notion of small markets versus big markets. I only say, you know, obviously we've had great success in San Antonio. Milwaukee Bucks just won the last championship. I mean, you know, Oklahoma City was in a position to compete for many years. So the league doesn't so neatly divide in terms of large and small markets anymore. I think not to say there aren't still things we need to focus on, but I think, again, in a positive way, where social media, digital media has changed the world, where if you're Giannis Antetokounmpo, you play in Milwaukee, it would be hard, you know, for those Bull fans to argue to him that, well, if you only came to Chicago an hour away, then you could be a big star. I mean, because he's about as globally famous as you can be. You can see his games in 215 countries and territories. It's true, if everything were equal, maybe a player would say, wow, I'd rather be in that bigger market, but nothing is ever equal. They care about who manages the team and their teammates and everything else. No, by the way, no different than for law students here, when you choose what to do after law school, many of you will choose not to just to go to New York or LA or Chicago. Say, I want to live in this market. That's my life choice. And I think anything that what we've seen in the pandemic, that I do think those in-person relationships are critically important, but people are realizing you don't necessarily have to be in those cities to do certain kinds of jobs. You can really do them from anywhere.
And can I just jump in and ask there, because we haven't asked this sort of genre of question, but with your being here, I have to ask them. When you were a law student down the street, and as we were chatting earlier, the Keller Center, where the Harris School of Public Policy is now housed, used to be New Grad Residence Hall, and you lived there. So, so you have linkages to both units.
It's nicer now.
It wasn't bad.
Did you aspire when you were a law student to becoming the commissioner of the NBA? Did you aspire to a career in professional sports? Like, what? Did you know this was the career path that you wanted to take when you were a law student, or was there a moment later? And do you feel that you, in choosing this path, kind of left behind your law roots, or are there lessons from the law school that you carry with you today?
So much there. So I'll try to be quick. So first of all, it never in my wildest imagination occurred to me that I would work in sports or at the MBA. And when I went to law school, so I went to Duke University undergrad, I worked for Congress for 2 years, and then came to the University of Chicago. I just assumed I would be a lawyer for my whole life. That's what I always wanted to be. I wanted to be a lawyer since I was a kid. Even when I worked for Congress, always sort of was on that path. I think I deferred 1 year, thank you, Dick Badger. At the time, it's like that was my plan. And then I clerked, as you mentioned, for Kimball Wood, Southern District of New York, and I was right on this path, going to be a lawyer. It wasn't until I went to work at Cravath, and I had a great experience working there, but after I'd been there for about a year, it took a while to, because I was so locked in that I think I liked the certainty, I said, maybe this isn't exactly the path I want to be on. And it was really more because in working at a big corporate firm in New York, I was doing a lot of media cases, and I just came to see that I liked the business side of it a lot. I was proud to be a lawyer. I had learned so much in law school, but I made up my mind relatively soon, the practice of law. So I clerked for a year, I now worked for years at a law firm, that I wanted to go more on the business side. And then, frankly, I stumbled on the MBA. I mean, David Stern had been a lawyer at Proskauer in New York before he was at the MBA. My dad had been a lawyer there. I didn't know him, but I wrote him a letter. Long story short, there was no internet at the time. It was like, a typed letter. I'm looking for advice. I ended up talking to him, and over several conversations, he ended up hiring me at some point, but very specifically not to be a lawyer. He wanted someone, there was then a strong legal department at the MBA, there still is, many times the size of when I got there, but he wanted someone to be his assistant. He liked the idea that person was a lawyer and thought like a lawyer, but he didn't want me to be within the legal department. But it's funny, he used to always joke as commissioner that on your tax returns where it says occupation, he would still put lawyer. He was very proud to be a lawyer, and I am too. And I always think of myself as a lawyer, and I find that the skills I learned at the University of Chicago, that I learned clerking for Judge Wood at Cravath, I mean, even though now in the context of my life, only a small portion of it really stuck with me. I mean, that sort of kind of problem-solving, issue-spotting techniques that you learn, particularly at the University of Chicago, like how to reason through issues. I find I use those skills every day of my life, and I really feel indebted to law school as a result.
Well, that seems like a very good note for us to end on. I'll just make a couple of wrapping.
Where are you going?
It's over here. I don't know why. I could have stayed there. But you know what? Now I'm over here. I'm not going back. So thank you so much for being here. I feel as though you braved the gauntlets of the deans incredibly well, and I'm sure that it was even more challenging than those labor negotiations that you have had to go through. And I feel confident that David Rubenstein feels his name was not used in vain, and that the room was put to very good use. And as Dean Miles mentioned at the beginning, this is part of our Perspective series, and we focus on where there's public policy and legal infrastructure to address issues of diversity and inclusion throughout our economy and throughout our country. And sports clearly plays a central role in a cultural moment, in a leadership moment that we want to be sure to take advantage of, whatever paths we all take. And I know our students particularly valued hearing how you put your University of Chicago's skills to use in a job to which probably not very many people currently aspire, but I bet more do now. It's a wonderful opportunity for all of us to think about how to deploy those tools in advancing issues of equal access, social justice, diversity and inclusion in lots of different important branches of the U.S. government, private sector, not-for-profit sector. And I think the example you've set has been inspiring to everyone here. So thank you so
very much
for taking the time to be here.
Thank you, everybody.